We are talking with Will Miles of Read and Reaction. His 2024 preview magazine is out. You can buy it on Amazon. Okay, so one of the sections that I was absolutely the most interested in was the part where you talked about the middle eight. For our viewers that maybe are not quite as analytical as you, can you explain in layman's terms?
Yeah, so the middle eight is basically the last 4 minutes of the first half and the first 4 minutes of the second half. And Bill Belichick was actually somebody who was really famous for looking at, hey, we want to score on the way in, get get the ball to start the second half and score on the way out. And all of a sudden you can completely turn the game. And if you think about Florida, I guess it was 2019 or maybe 2020 when Joe Burrow, would have been 2020 when Burrow was playing Kyle Trask, and they were going back and forth. The thing that tipped that game was LSU scored at the end of the first half and then got the ball and scored at the beginning of the second half. And all of a sudden, Florida was 14 points behind, and they kept scoring. But those two scores in a row for LSU kept them ahead and gave them a comfortable margin for the rest of the game. And so the middle eight is really an opportunity to double up, especially if you don't get the ball to start with. If you defer, then you get it to start the second half. But likewise, if the offense or if your opponent defers, now it's an opportunity for them to double up. And so being able to stop that, being able to win those 8 minutes can really turn a ball game. And even if you stop them to field goals, it can really turn a ball game. So Nick Knudsen actually wrote this part of the magazine, but it's an awesome look at what Florida did against its opponents and whether they won or lost the game and how that middle eight sort of impacted it.
Yeah, I find it. I've got your chart pulled up, which I'm not going to give everything away. Y'all need to order this magazine, but I find it so interesting that in every game that we lost the middle eight outside of Charlotte, which I don't know that I count Charlotte when I'm looking at these games. I'm looking at our SEC opponents and things like that. Florida lost. Like every game that they lost that middle eight, they lost the game outside of Charlotte. And so there was not a way that I'd looked at it before. I find it so interesting. Utah is particularly intriguing to me because we were outscored 10-0 during that time. And then Florida State, who, Florida could have beaten. 14 points for Florida State, only 3 for Florida during that middle eight. And, that changes the outcome of ball games. So if you're Napier, how do you get better there this year? Is it play calling? Is it better personnel? Is it better strength and conditioning? Like what comes into play there?
So I think it starts with the run game on both sides of the ball. So Florida last year, I'm actually working on an article right now where their defense was the worst in the SEC when it came up to giving explosive plays in the run game. So in the pass game, they weren't great, but they were kind of in the pack of the bad defenses in the SEC. But in the run game, they're like a defense all to its own in terms of giving up explosives. So that's the first thing is when you give up a bunch of explosive plays in the run game, you allow other teams to get the drive started, right? So a lot of times you'll see a team with say like 3.5 minutes left. They'll run a draw play or they'll run a pitch or they'll do something like that. If they gain like a yard, they'll burn 40 seconds because they're worried they might have to punt back to the opponent.
Right.
And if you give up 12 yards, well, now they're going, right? All of a sudden they start speeding up because you just gave up a first down and they've sort of flipped the field. Even if they have to punt, they'll be able to pin you deep. And so it gives them a more aggressive mindset. And so I think Florida a lot of times gave up an explosive run play to start those drives last year. And that was a place where they wound up losing that middle eight. The other place that I would go is the run game for Florida. Florida's running backs, one of the reasons that Montreal Johnson struggled, especially early in the year, and Trevor Etienne was a better option, is they were getting hit less than 2 yards from the line of scrimmage on average. And if you look 2 years ago, they were getting something like 2.7 yards past the line of scrimmage before they got hit. And that gives Montreal Johnson an advantage because he's a guy who needs to build up ahead of steam versus Etienne, who's a little bit more slippery.
Right.
So I think Montreal Johnson can have a huge year given that Florida's got 2 transfer tackles along with Austin Barber being healthy.
Yeah.
Jake Slaughter's getting a full year at center where he's the definitive starter. And they're moving Damian George into guard from tackle, where obviously he struggled at tackle last year, but he's a big dude. And so if Florida's running game can be more effective and they can get that 8, 9, 10 yards on the first play and then be the aggressor, because that's one of the things I think that Florida did to Graham Mertz last year was a little bit of a disservice. It did seem like it was 3rd and 7, 2nd and 9, an awful lot because they couldn't really get anything in the run game. Now, they would get an explosive every once in a while. Etienne would break one. Even Montreal Johnson would break one. But what they couldn't do is they couldn't make it 3rd and 2, get that conversion and keep the drive going. So there were a lot of times where Florida got the ball back with, say, 3:45 left, and they were punting back to the opposing offense with 2 minutes left, and then the offense would rip off a 25-yard run. And look, they're, if nothing else, they're setting up for a field goal. So to me, the 4 minutes, especially heading into halftime, the running game is the critical part, not necessarily the pass defense, because everyone's going to start with that run, the first or second play, to see if they can get things moving. And if they can't, they become more conservative. So what I would say is Florida either needs to hit those runs or Napier needs to be a little bit more aggressive. And then on a defensive side of the ball, they just got to stop the explosives, because that was a huge problem on the running game last year.
And you have a big section of that, which I'm going to talk about when we talk about defense in a minute. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure this is something they go over in the locker room, ad nauseum. But I find it very interesting as just an average fan looking at it, and I feel like I'm going to watch the game differently, paying more attention to that. But I definitely think there were times where, as fans, we were like, oh, we just wasted this opportunity here. We could go into to halftime with some momentum, but instead we're complacent and we're ready to just run into the locker room. And I think that, and not necessarily being able to put your finger on why it made you feel that way, but it did kind of deflate fans, during last season. So hopefully that's somewhere we improve.